Okay, looks like we've hit a critical mass, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Remy Verstraete. I'm a writer and strategist, part of the marketing group here at Lightcast, and with us today is senior economist Rucha Vankudre. She'll be our main presenter. So Rucha, if you can take us to the next slide, I'll lay out our roadmap. We've got one quick housekeeping slide for you, just so everyone knows how the system, how the GoToWebinar system will work today. And then the main event, of course, is moving up and moving forward. Rucha is going to share the goal of the report, kind of what was the motivation behind it, and then share the key findings, and then actually get into some practical application at the end as well. It'll come back to me for two quick slides, just related resources and some solutions to help you think through what might be some good next steps for you. And then we'll get into Q&A. So speaking of Q&A, we'll go to the next slide. And you should see, so on the left there, point number 1, that's how you can submit questions. So we encourage you at any point during the webinar today, as Rucha is presenting, no need to wait till the end. As soon as you think of a question, feel free to enter it in the box. Your interface should look like one of those two boxes. I think for most of you, it'll be the one on the right. So you can just click the questions button in your panel, go ahead and enter your question down at the bottom and hit send. And we'll be collecting those on our end, and then Rucha and I will be able to go through them at the end, and we'll get to as many as we can. Do note that there is no chat, so if you're looking for a chat feature and you can't find it, that's why. It's not you. It's just not there. So go ahead and use that questions box for anything that you want to submit as a point of discussion later. And then that second point, I just wanted to assure everyone that the presentation will be recorded, and we will be sharing the recording with everyone probably around tomorrow afternoon. So you can be expecting that in your inbox. So that's all I have. And now I'll pass things over to Rucha for the main event. Take it away.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rucha Vankudre, and I'm a senior economist here at Lightcast. And I'm very excited to present this report that we've been working on for almost about 6 months now. So the goal of this paper was really to try and understand the value of education for adult learners. And then we also wanted to use our data to try and understand key characteristics about them that we thought sort of lent to their success. To give you just a little bit of background sort of on Lightcast, which I know many of you know us, but for those of you who don't, and then also specifically on the group that I'm part of, which is the economics group within Lightcast. So we really focus on looking at our data and trying to understand how it can be used to answer questions that larger clients might have. So those might be universities, it might also be policy groups. We really try and kind of understand larger trends, and so I would say our research tends to be sort of at a more macro level. And so this question is sort of very typical of that, right? Looking at a particular group of learners and trying to understand how education might affect them more broadly. So just to give a quick sort of overview of the presentation, basically, as most of you I'm sure know, higher education really has not recovered from the pandemic. And amongst that, adult learners were some of the hardest hit. That's, as many people know, as the recession sort of hit, a lot of people were laid off of work, and then as things started to recover and there were many job opportunities available, a lot of people sort of switched from education towards going back into the workforce. And we think this is really unfortunate, as this paper found that adult learners really see large benefits from their education. And in general, when we compare them to a similar population who does not go back and get more education, we find that adult learners actually have 22% more upward mobility. And I'll go into sort of our definition of upward mobility in just a little bit. We also find that the upward mobility rates actually do vary quite a bit. They vary by type of institution, they vary by specifically the major people are studying, and then also by the industries and occupations, both that the learners are coming from as well as the ones they're going into. And so by really focusing on adult learners and understanding the impacts and what helps them have more mobility, we think this is a really good opportunity for institutions, because they're going to be helping these individuals become more successful while also increasing their enrollment in what is sort of a tricky time right So this is just sort of the motivation, what led us here. And as many people know, enrollment has been falling for quite a while. And in spring 2022, there were nearly 6 million students who were the age of 24. So it's about a third of the population. And it's been really decreasing over time, sort of as what we would expected to see compared to other recessions. So sort of in previous recessions, we always saw enrollment increasing. And that's very different from what we've seen now, sort of post-pandemic. So just to give you a little bit of background on our data, we have what we call social profiles data. This includes information that learners post about themselves. So it will say what education they were getting, what program they were enrolled in, what kind of work they were doing, sort of everything you think of that one might find, on an online profile. And so the way we did this was we defined adult learners as individuals who had not yet completed a bachelor's degree, had worked and or attended school for at least 7 years, and then went back and started this education that we think of as their relevant adult learner education for our analysis. So we have the first period, which is when we looked at where they were coming from, what kind of jobs they were doing. Then we have the second period, which is the relevant educational experience. And then we have the third period, which is where they return back to the workforce, or for many of them continue in the workforce. And we look at sort of what occupations they're going into there, and we use that to compare mobility. And that gave us about 270,000 adult learners that we studied for this paper. So the way that we defined upward mobility was to compare salaries in that period 1 versus period 3. And we had two sort of criteria that we used. The first was that we wanted the salary in period 3 to be higher than the salary in period 1. And then the second was that we also wanted the salary in period 3 to be at least $35,000. This was because we thought it was, important that just because you're earning more money, we still wanted you to be earning what we might consider to be a living wage. Obviously, this living wage varies very much by the region you're in, by your city. But we sort of use 35,000 as our benchmark. And the way the salary was calculated was by using the highest earning occupation that you had within 5 years of leaving school. The reason we kind of stuck with this 5-year period is, obviously as people stay in the workforce for longer, they develop lots of skills, salary can be based on many things. So we were sort of confining it to that 5-year period in the hopes that we were really capturing the effect of the education itself. Something important to note is that the way that we have salary information is based on the national data set that provides average salaries by occupation. So any movement that we capture is going to be a result of people changing occupations. Obviously, people can also make varying salaries within an occupation, and that is not something we are able to observe. So that is not sort of going into this calculation when we do our mobility calculations. And based on this definition of, period 3 being greater than salary in period 1, as well as having at least $35,000 in period 3, we find that approximately 56% of adult learners are upwardly mobile. So now I'm going to walk through sort of the key findings of our report. So the first one that we found was that adult learners who return to higher education have 22% higher upward mobility than non-learners. And if you look at the change in salary, this is, sort of from that period 1 to period 3, they have 140% larger increase in average salary. And so, this is obviously a very large number. If you look at it here, it's about $7,000 compared to the $3,000 for the non-learners. And it's important to keep in mind that that is in fact every year, right? So over the course of a lifetime, that could really definitely add up. Another question, just in case people have, is, obviously non-learners did not go back to school. So what are we using for period there? And the way we did that was we looked at people who started at the same time as these adult learners, and then we looked at the average time that people spend in education, which is about 3 to 4 years in our sample. And then we allowed for those non-learners to have that same growth over that time period, right? So we are comparing people who have been in the labor market for approximately the same period of time. A second important finding that we had was that adult learners from public institutions actually have greater mobility gains than those in private or for-profit institutions. And we think this is a really important finding because as many people know with the pandemic, public institutions, community colleges were among the hardest hit. And so we think that this is sort of a really nice opportunity for those institutions to get people back and say, look, you know, like our programs actually are very successful for adult learners. Next, we found that associate degrees from certain technical fields, such as engineering or health sciences, actually grant higher upward mobility to adult learners than bachelor's degrees in more general fields. And we think this is an important finding because, you know, many people say that they don't have the time to devote to a four-year degree. But what we're finding is that, you know, there are definitely associate degrees out there that can have really big impacts for adult learners. Fourth, we found that there's actually gains across a wide variety of industries. I think people often think of, you know, like the more mobile industries being those like information or healthcare, but we found that there are actually, you know, lots of high mobility in things that are sort of more traditional, like utilities and construction as well. And so you can see here, for example, that, you know, adult learners who go into utilities on average, 62% of them experience upward mobility, and they have an average annual salary gain of almost $10,000. And then sort of the last big finding we had was that in general, you know, you see a lot of sort of the same trends that you might see in other studies, which is that women tend to see lower mobility than men, and, you know, minorities tend to have lower mobility than Caucasians. However, there are some interesting opportunities where within certain majors, you'll actually see that women are doing better than men. And interestingly, in those cases, women are still enrolled in a much lower percentage than the men are. And so we think this is a great opportunity too for institutions to be encouraging women or minorities into these specific programs where they really tend to be very successful and really right now are under enrolling. Okay, so that's sort of the high level top findings. Moving on next to sort of some of the background research we did to try and understand our population. So who are adult learners? We found that in general, they're more likely to be male and white compared to our other social profiles data. This is, you know, social profiles already tend to be biased in that direction, and that was even more true sort of within our specific population. So you'll see that within our adult learners, almost 53% were male. And then when we looked at the race and ethnicity background, almost 84% were white when you compare that to profiles overall, which is closer to 80% white. We found that they're very likely, much more likely to be veterans. This is something I think, you know, most of you probably know. Veterans is one of sort of the larger adult learner populations, and we found that to hold true in our data as well. And we also found that a number of them had actually already attended school at some point and were now returning. Next, we looked at where do they come from. So what you'll see here is we looked at, these are that period one that I was referring to. These were the industries that the adult learners were coming from. So you'll see that almost 65% of adult learners come from healthcare, retail trade, public administration, and manufacturing. And then sort of across the other industries, there's a pretty good spread. In terms of the occupation families that adult learners are coming from, we find that a very large percentage come from sort of healthcare and social assistance and public administration, as well as retail trade. So the next step is how and where learning happens. So we looked at the types of programs that adult learners were enrolled in compared to sort of the more traditional learner population. And we found that adult learners were much more likely to be enrolled in associate degrees programs. You'll see that almost 30% are in fact enrolled in associate degrees. When you compare that to learners overall, that's really only about 12%. So a much larger population there. And also, you know, much less likely to be enrolled in master's degrees or doctoral degrees. We also found that they were more focused in programs that people might think of as those that align with like career outcomes. So for example, when we looked at bachelor's degrees, we found them to be more enrolled in business and health and in computer and information sciences. And what compared to traditional learners who also you can see were more enrolled in things like visual and performing arts, communication. We found similar patterns with the associate's degrees, also larger numbers in business, as well as health. And sort of an interesting point that you might notice here is that if you compare to engineering, particularly for the bachelor's degrees, they're much less likely to be represented. And that's interesting because, you know, we have a lot of work that shows that sort of engineering can be a very well-paying field. And we think that sort of speaks to the fact that, you know, like it is a tricky field to go into. And we think that there are probably opportunities there to try and get adult learners in. They're also much more likely to be enrolled in for-profit institutions. So overall in our profiles data, only about 5% of learners are enrolled in for-profit, and that's, you know, almost 20% or over 20% for the adult learners, which is quite a high percentage. And if you look at the types of schools, or rather the top schools that our learners are attending, we'll see University of Phoenix, Western Governors, which, you know, is important to note is actually a nonprofit, so that is the one exception. We do actually see in our traditional learners a lot of people also at University of Phoenix, which makes sense, I think, if you think of their sort of very large reach. And then we have other sort of large public universities, Penn State, UT Austin, Arizona State. And so then the final part of our analysis that we conducted was this mobility. So here I'll sort of talk through the main points that we found in terms of who was successful and who was less successful. So the first thing that we found is that the mobility rates and salary gain really vary a lot by the major that's being studied. So if you look at engineering, 72% of adult learners experience upward mobility if they go into engineering. And the salary gain is almost $20,000 annually, which is huge. The other top majors here with mobility are physical sciences, engineering tech, math, architecture, and then computer and information sciences. Conversely, if you look at those where we see the least upwardly mobile, we have liberal arts, fitness studies, homeland security, personal and culinary services. You'll notice that the average salary gain is actually negative here, and what that means is that the occupations that people start out in, on average, actually pay slightly more than those that they end up in after getting this degree. Sort of an important caveat to that, obviously, is that, you know, we would imagine a lot of these people are probably, you know, trying to become chefs. And because the way our data is structured, we only have one salary per occupation. And so, you know, it is possible that these individuals actually are seeing some sort of salary growth. It's just not in a way that we are able to measure. We also find, and this was one of the key findings earlier, that adult learners from public institutions have greater mobility than those in the private or for-profit institutions. A reason we think this is sort of an interesting point as well is, you know, as I was saying, community colleges really were hard hit during the pandemic. Whereas a lot of the for-profit institutions and private were able to keep more of their enrollment. A huge reason for that, anecdotally at least, is that, you know, a lot of public institutions at the time were not really set up to allow for remote learning in the same way that these for-profit institutions, which had already been doing this for quite a while, were able to. But now, you know, sort of a couple of years in, many public schools now do have programs that allow for more flexibility, that allow for remote learning. And so we think this is a really good opportunity right now. Public institutions now sort of have the technology to reach this larger audience. And we're hoping that sort of, you know, the evidence provided that they have these great mobility gains will be a huge selling point for them to bring in adult learners. This was another point that I mentioned earlier. So you can look here and you'll see that, you know, engineering, physical sciences, engineering tech, these are the bachelor's degrees that do have the highest amount of mobility for adult learners. But if you look at these here in light blue, you'll see that these engineering ones for associate's degrees, as well as this is a computer and information science associate's degree, and then some of the health professions all have higher mobility than these other sort of darker blue down here, which are bachelor's degrees, right? So what we're seeing is that, you know, a bachelor's degree in psychology or public administration actually has a lower mobility rate than an associate's degree in engineering or computer sciences. And then this now is looking at some of the demographic differences that we found by program. And so this was the point that I was making earlier. So, you know, in general, men are more mobile. This is partially due to the fact that they tend to choose majors that have higher mobility. However, what we find here is that there actually are some majors where men, sorry, I'm going to say that again. So we find two things. The first is that men tend to pick majors that are more mobile, but even within those majors, on average, controlling for that major, men still see more mobility, which is troubling. I think, you know, it's something we know, right? Women in general, there's a number of reasons they might not be earning as high salaries, moving into high paying occupations. So even once you control for the majors that are being selected, men are still more mobile. But then we find that there are these exceptions where we do see women doing better. So yeah, okay, sorry, I think that was reversed a little bit in order. So basically this is showing here that, you know, within computer science, this is the same major for men and women. Men have much more mobility than women. We see something similar in engineering. And so that's sort of, you know, showing that there's difficulties along gender lines in terms of mobility, but there are some exceptions. And then the next section sort of is talking about where we think that you could find learners who experience higher mobility. And we think these are good places for people to really target their campaigns. So you'll see, you know, for example, within accommodation and food services, adult learners who come from there tend to be approximately 63% of them experience mobility, and the average salary gain is about $15,000. You will probably notice that, you know, retail, trade, and accommodation and food services tend to be lower paid industries to begin with, right? So it's definitely true that part of the reason that we see higher gains here is because these people are earning less to begin with. However, I would say the fact that, you know, they're coming from these lower paying industries and still move into other industries that are higher paying is a very good sign. And at the same time, we also have other industries like utilities, which we don't typically think of as lower paying, and those also have quite high mobility rates. We did a similar analysis looking at these are the occupation groups that have the highest mobility. So you'll see people coming from customer and client support, maintenance, hospitality, food, and tourism. And you'll also see that the salaries here, the average salary gain is, you know, somewhere in the ballpark of around $20,000 annually, which is quite large. And then sort of the second part we did was looking to see where learners are going, where they experience a lot of mobility. So basically, if you look at institution, if you look at the top industries, these are that the people end up in. Utilities, which we saw, you know, was on the flip side as well, actually people going from utilities and still staying into utilities. We find that to be a really good opportunity. They experience about a $10,000 average salary gain. We find similarly for construction, these are sort of the top opportunities we think. And this is a really good place for institutions really to look for partnering with industries locally and trying to figure out sort of, you know, how can they start internships, those types of programs, because we find that learners who go into these industries do particularly well. And then finally, sort of just talking through a little bit of the practical applications, sort of how can you use this information, right? And how can you use data that looks specifically at what learners need to figure out how to help them succeed. So this is just sort of an example. We have many more if people are interested of the types of jobs people come from before they get their engineering degree, their associate's engineering degree. And you'll see we had a lot of people in our data coming from manufacturing machine operators, production workers, retail store managers, and then the types of occupations we saw them moving into sort of after they completed their education were computer support specialists, electrical technicians, project managers, and engineering technicians. And then something that our data can really provide is sort of the skills that needed to make this transition, right? So if you have someone who's coming in as a manufacturing machine operator, the types of skills that they tend to already have are some computer literacy, quality control, hand tools, and then the types of skills that are needed to sort of become this electrical and electronics technician and which we hope would be taught in the program would be things like, electromechanics, instrumentation, electrical wiring. And then we have sort of another example. This is for a bachelor's degree. So we see learners coming in as retail store managers, office administrative assistants, customer service reps, getting that degree and then becoming, accountants, business development managers, operation managers, financial analysts. And then similarly, if you were to look at sort of the skills that a retail manager might be coming in with, they'd be coming in with sales, communication, customer service leadership, and then the skills that are needed and could be taught in the program that would allow you to then become an operations manager are things like process improvement and business operations. And so using our data, you can sort of really dig into how you could design programs to help adult learners be successful. And that's sort of the majority of what I have to present. Sort of just overall that adult learners we really found do see these concrete large benefits from going back to education when we compare to those who didn't. And that, by focusing on sort of the factors that contribute to mobility, we really think that there's a win-win opportunity here for both the institutions and the learners themselves. And I will head it back over to Remy.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rucha. Thank you very much for walking through that. Great data. And yeah, so we're gonna blaze through a couple quick slides here. I just want to equip people even further with related resources and potential next steps before we get into the Q&A. So we'll go to the next slide. I wanted to highlight this, and I'll also drop this in the chat, the URL. So I'm going to send this out to everybody. But we do have an adult learner program research worksheet and a companion webinar that kind of goes with it. And the URL you see at the bottom of the screen and that I just shared out through the chat links to both of those. It's a free resource. You can download it, use it to kind of structure the question, make sure you're asking the right questions, think through what kind of data you might need to specifically focus on the program development or program review piece related specifically to adult learners, thinking through what kinds of data you need to think about the programs that might be attractive to them or that might serve them in your specific region. And so that webinar that goes with it, you can actually, I'm giving you permission to skip the whole first half of it if you want, because in the second half is where my colleague Morgan Halpert actually pulls up our labor market analytics platform, which is called Analyst, and he shows you how to use that platform to actually get that data. So worksheet is kind of what questions to ask and how to think through that. The webinar shows how Analyst helps answer those questions and make that more specific to your institution. So speaking of Analyst, we'll go to the next slide. And I wanted to highlight that solution in particular because part of our mission and our goal here at Lightcast is we don't want to merely provide data and research, though obviously we do want to do that, and that is the foundation of everything else that we do. But then once we do that, we also want to provide practical tools and solutions that help you personalize that, your institution, your region, your mission, your alumni, and figure out how to make decisions and move forward. So these are just 3 solutions I wanted to highlight because they're especially relevant to the things we've been talking about today. Analyst is what I mentioned on the previous slide, combines government labor market data, employer job postings, and career profile analytics. And that last piece is a data set that is very similar to the kind of data that Rucha just walked you through as far as looking at actual professionals in the workforce, where they are, what they do, where they went to school. So that's a relevant data set for our discussion. Alumni outcomes is another solution that is based on that same data set, but then we partner with you as an institution to take your student records and your data that you have that we don't, and we kind of merge the two to create an enriched data set that allows you to go a lot deeper and get more in-depth analytics specific to your institution's past students, as far as figuring out things like career pathways, where else did they go to school, what was their first, second, third job, 1, 5, 10 years out, that kind of thing, which is useful for a variety of purposes. I'm sure you can imagine, alumni engagement, program review, those types of things. And then skills match is not necessarily specifically related to the profile data, but I did want to highlight it because, as you saw in the end there when Rucha was talking through application, especially when you're serving adult learners, being able to approach it through a skills perspective is really valuable. And skills match is a tool that essentially enables you to enable adult learners to kind of build out their skill profile based on their work experience, the education they do have, whatever that may be, whether they completed it or not, figure out what skills they have, what skills they need to reach a particular career outcome, and then actually map that to the courses and programs that you offer at your institution. So there's a lot more, but you can browse that yourself at lightcast.io and then just click the solutions tab up in the top, click education. Though I am going to launch a quick poll right now. So heads up, it's gonna sort of take over your screen for a second. And this is just giving you an opportunity to signal to us whether or not you'd like someone from Lightcast to reach out to you. If you've heard this presentation and you're thinking this is really good data, but I really need practical tools to help me apply it and navigate what programs we should be offering, navigate how to engage adult learners from my institution, let us know. So that top option, if you're new to Lightcast, we can have somebody reach out to you, get to know you and your goals, and help you navigate potential solutions. Second option, if your institution already works with us, that's awesome. We'd be happy to connect with you and talk through the report and ways that you can apply it using the tools that you already have. And then, of course, if you want to say no, but thanks for asking, that's totally fine. We won't take it personal. So I'll leave that up for just another couple seconds, and then I'll take it down. And Rucha, you should be able to start taking a look at the questions. We did have a number come in while you were speaking, so if you want to start perusing those and finding some answer.
1 second.
Sure.
So some quick questions here about will the report be shared? Yes, the report is available on our website for download. I assume, Remy, you can put that somewhere maybe in the chat that people want to click on it?
Absolutely, yeah. I sent it out in the chat earlier, and I will resend it again now.
And, okay. Yeah. Question here from Angela. Did you use any age parameters? So that's a good question. So the way social profile data is structured is you can't actually see the age of anyone, really, for the most part. And most people also do not tend to write whether or not they completed high school, which would be sort of a nice proxy. So the way that we try to sort of control for that is what I was saying earlier about the 7 years, right? So the reason we pick the 7 years is if you figure that most people start, either attending higher education or working full time at the age of 18 on average, then 7 years from that would put them at the age of about 25. And that's sort of generally the definition that people use for adult learners. It tends to be, over the age of 24, 25. So that's why we made sure that everyone in our sample had at least 7 years of either education or full work experience to sort of try and get us to what we believed would be an adult learner population. Next question. Download. Yeah. Okay. Causality of public versus private discrepancy. So to be super clear, none of this, you can't really do a causality study, right? Because in order to do a causality study well, you would have to take someone and then you'd have to take a bunch of learners, right, and randomly distribute them to private schools or for-profit or public schools, right, which is not in fact doable. So nothing we are seeing here is causal, right? All we can say is sort of we compared them to other people. We hope that by having a large enough population, some of the bias is wiped out, but you are absolutely right that it's entirely possible that there's the reason that people who go to public have higher mobility than those who go to private, or more specifically for profit, could have to do with the characteristics of the learners and who is choosing to go to which school. Do we have data broken down by state? So we do, in the sense that all of our data can be broken down by state. If anyone is interested in like particular states and wants to shoot me an email after this, I'm happy to share those numbers with you. the reason we didn't really necessarily put that into the report is sort of twofold. First, obviously we can do this much better with large states than we can with small states, right? Just for sample constraints, but also because you could think of it as, there's different ways to do the regionality. You could do it by the institution itself, like where the school is located. You can do it by where the learner is located, which are obviously correlated. But since we figured that in general, most people wouldn't really be moving and institutions would be sort of staying put, we didn't really present that in the report, but it is data we have.
Yeah, there's one question someone had asked, do you believe these numbers are skewed because of where and who replied to the survey? I'm not surprised to see more white males if there's a large swath of former military. Could you just revisit real quick sort of who, that it wasn't survey based, but
right.
what
so this is not survey based at all. So we do not have to worry about that. To the extent that, is it skewed because, more white men tend to have online social profiles because they submit their work history? Yes. That's certainly true. I would much rather have a representative sample, but I think the thinking is sort of, this is a very hard thing to measure. And so I think it would be a mistake to say, there's no value in the data at all because the data is biased in certain ways. And when we, at least do the comparison of adult learners versus non-adult learners, right? To some extent, all of the data is going to be skewed towards white men. So we are at least, making somewhat of a similar comparison in that particular aspect.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, N population size was 270,000 adult learners. Was skills acquisition factored into this work? I'm not exactly sure what the person means. If they want to send a follow-up question, I can try. To the extent that, do we know, we don't really have any way of seeing specifically what skills people acquire during their degree, right? Sort of the best proxy we can do is, what we assume that if you go into a certain occupation, then you at least were equipped with the skills for that occupation. And so when we do some of our skills analysis, we based it on that assumption. But because of the way social profiles are structured, people's profiles can be tagged with skills, but there's no time for when they're tagged, right? So for example, if I'm tagged with the skill data analysis, there's no way to know if I picked that up at this job or while I was in school or at a previous job. So because of that, we can't really isolate what skills we think people got while they were in education. What else? Do we see any certifications like IT having an equivalent impact? So that's actually an excellent question. It's something that we would love to do. We are hoping to do in the future. The problem that we have right now is that the way people record certifications in social profile data is not at all standardized. And so because of that, it makes it really hard to sort of pick apart any effects. We're sort of hoping, I think, that as more people move to micro-credentials and certifications, there will be more of a standardization. I definitely think it's analysis that would be really interesting. It's just not something that we are able to do at the moment.
And Rucha, would you mind going to the last slide that has the contact information on it? There's a couple of folks asking how they can follow up with you, and that's how they can do it. So
yes, there's my email address. Sorry, Robbie, I'm having trouble reading the full question. I can only read part of it. I don't know if you have a solution to that.
Yeah, no, other than to click on it and then it'll populate in the box. There is a question. Sorry?
What if the question is longer than the box itself here?
Yeah, it is a problem. There's one here that I thought was pretty, a question about, does upward mobility and salary gain account for tuition and opportunity cost? Is that factored in?
So no, it does not. In the sense that we are measuring the difference in salary between what they were earning before and what they were earning after. So you're right that, once you start accounting for tuition, the math is a little bit trickier, but I think the important thing to keep in mind is that we are looking, this is an average salary gain, right? So even if, if on average an adult learner is earning $7,000 more, if you assume that they continue working in an occupation that earns at least that much for the rest of their lives, which I think is somewhat reasonable assumption, they would be making up the cost in almost all cases.
Question about, did you include Canadian data in your research, or is this strictly US based?
This is strictly US. Data enabled.
Did the research include preferred delivery mode for these adult learners, online versus campus, hybrid?
It did not, because for the most part, we cannot observe what type of education, whether, I mean, you can make some assumptions. Obviously, we know some programs are online only, but in general, there is not information in the social profiles that allows us to see whether or not the degree is online or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and there's another question about, do you have the data broken down for military affiliated learners? There was a section where you talked about veterans.
Yes, actually, we did do some analysis. Off the top of my head, from what I remember, veterans had slightly higher mobility. We also have a bunch of analysis sort of looking at the top majors they go into, what the mobility rates are, sort of all of that broken down. That, you know, obviously a lot of the data did not make it into the report itself. But if anyone has particular interest in that, feel free to send me an email and I can pass that along.
There's an interesting one. Given that we're using profile data, is there any concern using the profiles that people aren't always honest about degrees and salaries? So again, that kind of gets back to how you did the wage calculation, if you want to read
So the salary is not an issue because we are, most people don't actually write, there is no salary information in profiles data. What we were doing is looking at the occupation that a person says they're in, and then looking at the salary associated with that occupation nationally. So, you know, if this was analysis you wanted to do more regionally, you could use more regional salaries as well, but we generally find national to be a pretty good proxy. As for people not being honest, I mean, I think, yeah, people can definitely not be honest. I actually think in some ways social profiles are a better proxy for that than resume data, though, because at least LinkedIn, for the most part, and other social profiles are public. And so I think, you know, people generally, for the most part, if they know that, you know, future employers are going to be looking, will hopefully not be writing things that are completely untrue. I don't also think that there would be any reason to sort of, you know, suspect that there's biases in terms of who's being dishonest. So, for example, I don't think it's necessarily true that, you know, a person in major A would be more or less likely to be dishonest than a person in major B. And since the majority of our analysis for this paper is really like comparing across industries, across occupation groups, I do think that to some extent you would expect that bias to kind of wash out.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Responding to one question in the chat right there. Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I really can't read like the top half of some of these questions.
Yeah.
What else?
I think we've hit a lot of them. A lot of them are kind of different versions of or iterations on questions that you've addressed. So I think we're looking pretty good. So unless you see anything else that you'd like
one here I want to address, if you don't mind. So there's a question here that says, is it concerning / surprising that only 56% of adult learners achieve upward mobility? So I have a couple points to that. So obviously I understand that number feels low, but some sort of like an important counterpoint I would say is that if you actually look at people who are getting bachelor's degrees, traditional learners, and produce like do a similar calculation, you still find it's actually only about 70% to 74% who experience upward mobility. So it's not like, you know, everyone else, like the other number we're comparing it to is like 100% versus 56%, right? It's actually closer to ballpark, I'd say about 70%. And the reason for that is, you know, like we all know people, right, who maybe go in to professions that don't pay as well, right? And so, you know, there's a lot of professions that obviously are very fulfilling, but might not meet our $35,000 threshold. So, you know, I think that's one reason. Another reason is, as I said, we aren't able to capture salary increases for people who stay in an occupation. So obviously we know, right, that there's occupations where as you get an education credential, your salary will go up. And so we think, if anything, that this is probably like a lower bound. The actual number is probably higher. But the fact that we see that 56% when comparing to the non-learners who have 46%, I think is sort of the more interesting comparison, right? It's sort of the comparison of those two numbers rather than the 56% overall.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. And one question that came in after that, maybe an idea for future research, the one about incarcerated and formerly incarcerated adult learners. Do you know if you or someone on your team has done any research in that area?
You know, not that I know of, actually. I think it's a really interesting question, but I'm not sure the extent to which we would be able to actually pick those people out to be able to conduct research using this particular method. Just because I don't think that's generally something that people are going to put on their
Right.
profile.
On their profile, yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Interesting idea, though. Good. Okay, well, I am going to go ahead and wrap things up here, and we do have these list of questions that have been submitted, so we can go through and try to follow up one-on-one afterwards as well, if there's anything we didn't get to. Also, heads up to everybody, thank you again for joining us today and taking an interest in this. We hope it was helpful and informative for you. As soon as the webinar ends, you'll get one last pop-up that is just a 3-question survey that's essentially just asking for feedback on the webinar itself. So anything that we could do better in the future, any follow-up questions that we didn't get to here or that you didn't think of in time, feel free to put those in there and we will be in touch. So thank you again, and thank you, Rucha, and everyone have a good rest of your afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.